The late-war skies over the Pacific had a texture that pilots never forgot. Even on clear days, there was a thin grey haze that softened the horizon and made distance difficult to judge. High-altitude winds pushed long sheets of vapor into narrow bands that looked harmless from the ground, but created strange shadows when viewed from above. For Japanese pilots, those shadows mattered. They could reveal an approaching bomber formation or hide a pair of escorts waiting on the edges of the cloud deck. Every shift, every flicker of grey demanded attention. Japanese fighter units had spent years learning how to read these distortions. They had grown skilled at spotting American aircraft by the shine on a canopy, the faint reflection of sunlight on wings, or the familiar silver flash of a Mustang diving from above. They were trained to catch small details quickly because hesitation meant death, and among those details nothing stood out more sharply than the polished metal of American fighters. Even at long distances, the bright glint of aluminium separated friend from foe. That was why at first the reports made little sense. Pilots returning from interception routes began describing something unusual, a Mustang they could not see until it was already too close. Not a formation, not a new squadron, a single fighter with a silhouette that seemed to dissolve into the haze behind it. Some claimed it looked like a shadow, others insisted it wasn't there at all until the moment it opened fire. Officers dismissed these early accounts. They blamed late-day lighting, exhaustion, or the natural confusion that came from flying long patrols over open water, but rumors spread quickly, and the more pilots talked, the more consistent the descriptions became. The aircraft was definitely a P-51. It climbed like one, moved like one, and attacked with the same confidence Mustang pilots were known for, but its appearance had changed. It no longer reflected sunlight. It didn't flash or shine or flicker. It simply blended into the background in a way no American aircraft had before. Across airfields in Formosa, Okinawa, and the Philippines, Japanese unit leaders asked their men to pay closer attention. They wanted shape, color, and angle details, anything that might explain what was happening. But as more pilots returned with similar reports, the situation grew stranger. Some described the Mustang as darker than usual, almost black when seen from above. Others said it looked gray, as though it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. One pilot stated that the fighter appeared unfinished, as if covered in soot. Another said it looked like a ghost, there but not quite real. American intelligence would later confirm what these pilots were witnessing. It wasn't a new model, nor a new engine, nor a secret structural change. It was paint, or rather a filtered composite designed to break up the highly reflective metal finish that Mustangs were known for. Ground crews had begun applying a specialized matte black mixture to the upper surfaces of certain aircraft. It wasn't glossy. It wasn't smooth. It created a texture that scattered sunlight instead of reflecting it. And combined with the natural haze that dominated the Pacific sky, it produced an illusion Japanese pilots were completely unprepared for. From below, the aircraft still looked familiar, but from above, where Japanese fighters often approached from, the blackened wings and darkened fuselage blended into the cloud shadows and the muted color of the sea. The Mustang's outline no longer stood out against the background. Its angles disappeared, its curves flattened, and the glint that Japanese pilots relied on for detection was gone. In the opening weeks of its use, the effect was more powerful than anyone expected. American pilots reported being able to climb toward enemy formations without being spotted. Their altitude advantage increased, their engagement ranges improved, and their first attack success rate rose sharply. In debriefs, several Mustang pilots noted the same thing. Japanese fighters seemed confused. They were losing sight of Mustangs even when they were close enough to see propeller blur. One fighter squadron on the Japanese side described these new aircraft as shadow wings. Another called them dark Mustangs. But unofficially, among pilots who had survived encounters, a different phrase emerged, one that captured their growing anxiety. They began calling the aircraft the black filter, a reference to the way the plane seemed to vanish into the background, as though a filter had been applied to erase its shape from the sky. The fear wasn't immediate. Japanese pilots were experienced and most did not panic easily, but the uncertainty grew with each encounter. They couldn't rely on distant visual spotting anymore. They couldn't assume that a Mustang would betray its position with a flash of sunlight. And as one pilot reported, when we saw it, it was already attacking. American commanders observed this shift with interest. They began assigning the modified Mustangs to flights requiring altitude penetration or surprise interception. Successes mounted, losses decreased, and crews quickly realized that the camouflage was doing more than blending the aircraft into the environment. It was changing the psychology of the battlefield. For Japanese pilots, recognition was the first step of survival. If they could not spot an enemy early, they could not plan an escape. They could not adjust altitude, break formation, or reposition. And when the enemy they failed to spot was a Mustang, the consequences were immediate. In the final months of the war, the Pacific sky was a complex, unpredictable place. Fuel shortages forced Japan to limit training. Replacement pilots arrived with minimal flight hours, and veteran aces were spread thin across multiple units. In this weakened environment, the sudden appearance of a nearly invisible American fighter created a disruption far beyond its technical effect. It caused hesitation, it created doubt, and doubt was enough. This is where the story begins. At the moment, pilots on both sides realized that something as simple as a layer of paint could change the balance of an entire air campaign. The black filter wasn't a miracle weapon. It didn't make Mustangs faster or stronger, but it made them harder to find. And in a sky where seconds decided survival, that was more than enough to reshape the fight. The first reactions did not come from American pilots. They came from the men hunting them. In early 1945, Japanese intercept controllers on several island airfields began receiving confused radio calls from Zero and Hay-8 pilots patrolling high over the Pacific. These patrols were routine. The pilots knew the patterns of American flights, knew the typical visual signatures, and had grown used to the familiar silver glint of long-range Mustang formations approaching from hundreds of miles out. That silver flash was unmistakable. It was the warning every Japanese pilot learned to look for. But in the span of a few weeks, several patrols made the same unusual complaint. They could hear the enemy. They could sense the enemy. But they could not see the enemy. The controllers at first assumed cloud layers were the culprit. High-altitude haze, moisture distortion, and Pacific glare often masked formations until the last minute. This was not new, but when pilots insisted that the incoming aircraft were below cloud level and somehow invisible until firing range, commanders began to suspect wrecked goggles, eye fatigue, or simple pilot error. The pilots, however, pushed back harder. They insisted something was different. One Zero pilot described it as planes without sunlight. Another used the phrase darkened wings. A third claimed the Americans were flying with their undersurfaces covered, creating a false horizon that made them impossible to track. Nothing about their descriptions matched the silver sheen US fighters were known for. What none of them realized yet was that they were not seeing a trick of the sky. They were seeing the effects of a new surface treatment the Americans quietly applied to select long-range fighters. A darkened, contrast-reducing filter layer that suppressed reflections and altered the profile of the aircraft at distance. American engineers called it a finish. Japanese pilots came to call it a nightmare. At first, only a handful of P-51s carried the new coating, and they were deployed in pairs alongside standard finish Mustangs to test how Japanese fighters reacted. The results were immediate. When pairs of mixed-finish P-51s approached an enemy patrol, the Japanese usually saw only one of them, the conventional silver one reflecting sharp Pacific sunlight. By the time they realized a second fighter was present, the hidden Mustang was already maneuvering behind them, closing rapidly. In several early skirmishes, the darkened Mustangs achieved firing position before the enemy even registered their silhouette. Combat reports from American pilots reflect the same pattern. They often described Japanese fighters breaking away too late, turning into dives with a delay that would not have happened if they'd detected both Mustangs at range. One pilot described it in a single line. "They never saw me coming, not once." Meanwhile, Japanese squadron leaders could not understand the sudden shift. There was no change in American tactics. Altitudes remained familiar. Escort patterns remained predictable. Yet patrols that once spotted American fighters 20 miles out now caught sight of them at only 4, sometimes less, even under perfect visibility. The Japanese believed the Americans had introduced a new kind of smoke system, or a kind of reflective dampening cloth. Some intelligence officers suggested invisible celluloid film coverings. Others theorized the Mustangs were simply approaching at lower sun angles. But even those explanations fell apart when patrols began to report dark shapes rising out of the ocean haze, Mustangs that should have shone like mirrors at that angle. The camouflage was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It erased the Mustang's primary weakness, its brilliant metallic visibility. The Pacific was a battlefield of light, harsh, direct, omnipresent. Under that light, aluminium aircraft stood out like signal mirrors, but the black filter coat reduced the Mustang's signature by flattening its reflectivity. It didn't make the aircraft darker, it made it neutral. It made it absorb rather than scatter the sunlight that betrayed aircraft positions at long range. Japanese pilots were trained to detect the smallest flash of light at extreme distance. They relied on spark reflections, wing glints, and the tiny but unmistakable horizon shimmer that revealed a climbing or diving aircraft. The Mustangs with the filter produced none of it. Squadrons began reporting ghost fighters, aircraft that appeared suddenly where there had been nothing moments before. Their silhouettes seemed to emerge only when they banked or fired, as if they were blending into the horizon itself. These reports were initially dismissed by higher command, who believed the pilots were rattled or misidentifying distant clouds. But as more units filed similar accounts, the tone shifted. Something had changed. Something had made the Americans harder to find, harder to avoid, and far harder to fight. Japanese commanders were not just confused. They were beginning to worry. Because in the Pacific, visibility meant survival. And anything that threatened that balance threatened their entire air strategy. This was only the beginning. The darker Mustangs were not just harder to see, they were being deployed in ways that magnified their new advantage. Escorts, intercepts, dives, sweeps, every mission profile changed once the enemy could no longer track you with trained eyes. And soon, the Japanese high command would receive the first hard evidence that their pilots were not imagining things. They would see photographs. They would see wreckage. And they would realize the sky itself had changed. The first squadron to receive the modified Mustangs launched before dawn. The ground crews watched them disappear into the early morning haze, the silhouettes of their wings vanishing far sooner than anyone expected. Even the Americans standing only a few meters from the runway realized something unusual. The new finish swallowed shadows, absorbed glints, and dissolved the aircraft's outline. The pilots didn't discuss it over the radio. They didn't need to. They could feel it. The aircraft no longer reflected the soft pre-sunrise light like every polished fighter before it. It behaved more like a moving patch of dim sky. As they climbed, the sun pushed over the horizon, striking the Mustang's surfaces. The reaction was immediate. Instead of producing bright flashes like aluminium airframes always did, the light simply muted against the matte coating, breaking across the uneven pigment and scattering into nothing. To the Japanese scouts already airborne miles ahead, the sky seemed empty. The P-51s were there, but they no longer looked like aircraft. Their shapes blurred, their wings lost definition. and against the layered gradients of the Pacific morning, they resembled shifting shadows rather than man-made machines. The squadron commander saw this effect first, watching the wingmen on either side of him fade in and out of the blue-gray sky. He knew this would be the real test, not the painting itself, not the briefing, but the moment when the enemy realized far too late what they were up against. 20 minutes into the patrol, Japanese observers finally noticed something. Their radio pickups registered unfamiliar propeller noise, but visual scans returned nothing. Their pilots strained their eyes against the horizon. Clear sky, no silhouettes, no glints. They didn't understand that this was the purpose. The new coating didn't make the Mustang invisible, it made it unrecognizable until the moment of attack. It removed the traditional cues Japanese pilots relied on: the wing shine, the fuselage reflections, the predictable contrast changes. And as the formation of P-51s cut across the morning light, their airframes seemed to slide through the air like dark, undefined shadows. That was when the Japanese scouts finally spotted something, but it was wrong. Their brains tried to fit the shapes into known categories: twin-engine bombers, drifting cloud shadows, distant seabirds, anything except fighters designed to kill them. By the time they realized the truth, the Mustangs were already behind them. The squadron leader gave no dramatic order, no flourish, just a calm correction to the formation and a simple phrase in a level voice. "Engage." The P-51s dropped into position with fluid precision. Their engines roared in synchronized bursts as they accelerated toward the unsuspecting scouts. The Japanese pilots attempted to break formation, but the angle was already lost. The Mustang's new finish had stolen precious seconds, and in air combat, a second was life. The first pass came in complete shock. The Japanese leader barely had time to bank before tracers swept past his canopy. The enemy wasn't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to be invisible. They weren't supposed to appear from a sky that had been empty moments before. Behind him, two more Japanese aircraft fell into defensive spirals, uncertain where the attack was coming from. They searched for the bright flashes of polished metal, for the typical silver streak of an American fighter, but nothing in their training had prepared them to track aircraft that rejected sunlight instead of reflecting it. The P-51s surged past them, climbing again, disappearing not upward but into the sky itself. For the first time, Japanese pilots experienced something that would become far more common as the war progressed. An enemy they could hear. An enemy they could feel. But not an enemy they could reliably see. The second attack came moments later, and this time the Mustangs were close enough that the Japanese could finally discern their outlines. But even then, the shapes looked distorted, as if the aircraft were partially embedded within the horizon. Their wings blended with the distance. Their fuselages appeared flatter. Their shadows vanished before they formed. The black filter was not a color. It was an illusion engineered into pigment, a way of forcing the human eye to misjudge shape, distance, and direction all at once. The fight ended quickly, not because the Americans outnumbered their opponents, and not because the Mustang was inherently superior, but because the enemy simply couldn't react fast enough to something they had never seen before. The last surviving scout transmitted a frantic radio message before diving for cloud cover. His words were clipped, strained, and nearly unintelligible under stress. They aren't silver anymore. They look wrong, like shadows, like ghosts. I cannot track them. The first recorded combat test of the new black filter Camouflage came on a morning when visibility shifted from clear to hazy within minutes. A patrol of P-51s climbed above the low cloud deck, their engines holding a steady rhythm as they began a slow sweep toward a known interception corridor. Nothing in their behavior suggested that this sortie would be any different from the dozens they had already flown, and yet the pilots themselves carried a quiet awareness that today's flight would answer the question haunting every ready room. Would the black filter pattern actually work under real combat conditions? Would it make any meaningful difference against trained opponents who understood light, angles, and camouflage far better than most American airmen? Far to the west, the Japanese formation that would unknowingly become the test case was already in the air. Their mission planners had studied American patrol patterns, and their lead pilots approached the area with a sense of routine confidence. They expected to spot the P-51s easily, long before the Americans saw them. That confidence came from habit, but habit is often the most vulnerable element in war. They scanned the horizon for the familiar silhouettes, expecting the usual silver or olive-toned glint that betrayed American aircraft from miles away. But the sky remained empty. The air seemed still, featureless, unbroken. No reflection, no flash, no forward shimmer of sunlight bouncing off metal. Inside the P-51 formation, the lead pilot noticed the first sign of enemy movement. It appeared only as a slight break in the distant cloud layer, a subtle displacement that might have passed unnoticed by anyone not trained to detect motion rather than shape. He called the contact quietly over the radio, but the rest of the formation remained visually unaware. Even the second element, trailing slightly behind and above, could not confirm the sighting, yet the lead was certain. Something was coming toward them, and they were not being seen in return. The Japanese pilots pressed forward, unaware that they were closing the distance on an aircraft group that had effectively erased its own visibility. What they were flying toward was not a formation that blended with the sky, but rather one that denied their eyes the normal cues that shaped recognition. No highlight line along the wings, no reflective flash from propeller arc, no shimmering brightness along the canopy. The black filter coating absorbed more light than standard camouflage, flattening surfaces that usually betrayed shape. For the first time, the P-51s were not simply harder to see. They were genuinely disappearing into the sky around them. At last, one of the Japanese wingmen spotted movement, but even then he hesitated. The shapes were too muted, too inconsistent with what he expected. He reported uncertain contact, noting that the silhouettes looked wrong, as though the aircraft were distorted or partially transparent. His leader dismissed the report at first, assuming atmospheric distortion, but ordered a slight course adjustment to verify. That decision brought the two formations within visual striking range. And only then did the Japanese pilots realize their mistake. The P-51s were not distant nor distorted. They were close, very close, and already maneuvering for advantage. The American pilots did not rush. Their training emphasized steady positioning over rash engagement. They spread into a shallow combat line, using the element of surprise as calmly as one might adjust a throttle. Their leader instructed them to hold formation until he issued the order. The Japanese formation, momentarily frozen by the sudden appearance of aircraft they had not seen approaching, struggled to reorganize. They attempted to climb, then turned defensively, but their maneuvers lacked cohesion. The suddenness of the encounter had broken their timing, the rhythm that experienced pilots rely upon to survive. When the lead American pilot finally gave the signal, the P-51 formation acted with practiced precision. They separated into pairs and angled downward into a smooth, controlled dive. Their attack was not a dramatic burst of speed, but a measured descent designed to keep their energy advantage. The Japanese attempted to roll away, but the Mustangs were already setting firing angles. They relied not on speed alone, but on the tactical clarity created by the black filter camouflage. Even as they attacked, the Mustang pilots remained deceptively difficult to track. Their profiles blended with the shaded sky, forcing their opponents to rely on instinct rather than sight. The first firing pass was short and controlled. Tracer lines cut through the air but did not announce themselves until they had already reached their targets. One Japanese fighter attempted to brake sharply, but the Mustang behind him held the line, adjusting only slightly before releasing a second burst that found its mark. The enemy aircraft rolled away, trailing thin smoke. Others darted in different directions, unsure of where the attacks were originating from. It was not the violence of the American attack that disrupted them. It was the inability to visually map the threat. As the engagement continued, the Japanese pilots began reporting the same unusual observation. They could hear engines, they could sense motion, but they could not confidently distinguish the Mustangs in the sky. Some described them as dark shapes without edges. Others said they saw only the flash of muzzle fire before losing the silhouette entirely. The black filter pattern was proving deceptively simple in design but overwhelmingly effective in practice. By absorbing reflective cues, it forced enemy pilots into a state of visual uncertainty, making precise tracking nearly impossible. The Americans maintained discipline, refusing to scatter or chase prematurely. Their leader kept them anchored to a central point, ensuring that no one drifted too far into isolated territory. The Japanese fighters, meanwhile, began drifting out of their own cohesion, each pilot fighting his own private battle against an opponent whose visibility changed depending on angle and lighting. The engagement became increasingly one-sided, not because of superior numbers, but because of superior clarity. The Mustangs could see, their opponents could not. The final phase of the encounter unfolded with calm inevitability. The Japanese pilots attempted to disengage, diving toward the cloud deck for cover, but the Americans had the altitude advantage and followed in measured pursuit. Even as they descended, the black filter camouflage continued to distort Japanese visual tracking. The Mustang pilots selected their final firing angles carefully, avoiding unnecessary risk. By the time the surviving enemy aircraft reached the shelter of the clouds, the battle had already been decided. In the aftermath, the American formation regrouped, reassembled in the quiet sky as if the engagement had been nothing more than a routine exercise. Their leader made no dramatic statements. He simply instructed them to resume patrol. The test had provided the answer they needed. The black filter camouflage was not merely functional, it was transformative. It had reshaped the visual logic of aerial combat. And across the ocean, long before reports reached headquarters, the first Japanese pilots who survived the encounter began circulating their own conclusion. The P-51s were no longer behaving like the bright, easily tracked aircraft they were accustomed to. Something had changed, something subtle, something dangerous. They did not yet understand the science behind the black filter, but they understood its effect. It made the Mustangs appear as though they were emerging from nowhere.